Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
What are the words you think of when you hear the name Bill Gates? Tech visionary?
Check.
Innovator?
Yep.
Philanthropist?
Totally.
I don't know. Maybe some people would think vaccine microchip implants.
Yeah.
Truly.
Supporter of nuclear energy.
Yeah, that's one too.
A lot of stuff.
That's a phrase.
Yeah.
How about billionaire, nerd, savior, and king?
Also works.
That's the title of a new book by Anupreeta Das, South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. It focuses on the life of what many would consider a pretty complicated and extremely accomplished individual.
Got it. Nailed. Anupreeta Das joins us now from New York. The full title of her book, by the way, is, as you just said, Billionaire, Nerd, Savior, King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape Our World. It is out today. Preeta, it is so nice to have you here on Bloomberg Businessweek. I always think about a book like this, someone very well known. We talk about Bill Gates a lot here at Bloomberg. Why did you write this book? What was it about Gates beyond being one of the world's richest and most recognizable? Was there one specific event, or just why did you do it?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. Two stories. One is that when in 2014, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, I came across Bill Gates' fortune and the investment firm that manages it. Now, very few people knew about it. It's called Cascade. And the way his money was invested, from the Four Seasons Hotel to farmland to all kinds of assets, made it really interesting because it was like an investment firm, but belonging to one man. And so in 2021, I'd moved to the Times, and then I got pulled into the reporting when the divorce of Bill and Melinda happened, because I had this context for their fortune. And so that then got me thinking about, who is this man? We'd always thought, as you said, we'd always thought of him in all of these different ways, but who is he behind all of these kind of images? So in 2021, that was my aha moment, and I thought it's worth investigating the persona and the man.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here, because it's 4 decades in public life, and he's done a lot, not just when it comes to building Microsoft, but also, of course, philanthropy. I loved the excerpt of the book in the New York Times just a few days ago about his evolving relationship with Warren Buffett. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you reported not just that part of the book, but also who you spoke to paint this portrait of this complicated person?
I mean, I can't divulge my sources, but outside of that,
you can. You can if you want.
I can if I want. Did Warren talk to you?
Well, Warren spoke on the record. He is, in fact, I used to cover, again, a lot of this goes back to the Journal when I was a reporter. I used to write about Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. So the relationship of the two men was also equally interesting. The first time I saw them at the Berkshire Hathaway meeting, just kind of walking around, talking to shareholders. And it just struck me as kind of a very casual but very intimate friendship. And then I began looking at it and seeing that, each has talked about the other and sort of the magic of their friendship over the decades. And, Bill Gates definitely has kind of advertised that piece of it. It's almost like part of his brand. Every year, nearly every year, on Gates Notes, his blog, he posts something like a goofy video or a post dedicated to Buffett. And so that was really interesting to me. But in recent years, I think once Buffett decided that he had always said that he wasn't going to give his money to anyone. He hadn't decided who he was going to give his money to after his death. But there was always like an assumption that the Gates Foundation stood to get all of that money. And when he eventually decided who was going to get that money after he died, it was not going to be the Gates Foundation. And so I think there was a little bit of tension there that I tried to capture in that piece that the Times ran. And it was, I think they have very different lifestyles. Buffett, as I'm sure you guys know, is kind of more folksy, simple sort of person, very Midwestern. And then Gates has more of the traditional trappings of a billionaire. So it was interesting to see their divergent paths, but also examine the basis of their friendship.
You said earlier about, you wanted to kind of dig into the persona and the man. Are they that different?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that plays into a lot of what we in the media, how we and what we write and what we choose to write feeds into the image of a person who's in the public eye, in the sense that you interact with someone, you see him or her in a closed setting, you get more of a sense of who they are and based on interactions, based on your sources, you start creating this image of a person in the media. So it's true, the persona is based on many fundamental elements of who the person is, but then it also takes on its own life. And then if you're a billionaire or you have like a lot of resources that you can dedicate to that, then I think you're basically sustaining, nurturing, minimizing, enhancing certain aspects of that image to really suit your needs and ends. And this isn't necessarily nefarious, but it's just what image making can do. And so I think there are elements of a person's internal personality or like in closed settings, and then how that feeds into a persona and how then people kind of keep manufacturing and finessing it, which to me was really interesting about Gates.
Did you like him as you did this process?
Well, he didn't grant me an interview, so that, I couldn't tell you any more than that. But
you talked to a lot of people about him, and
I did,
we can
of
get
course.
a picture of someone maybe clearer than the narrative that's out there publicly.
Absolutely. I think what was most interesting to me is that the essential person has not changed, right? He's mellowed, obviously, over the decades, we all do. But his essential personality, the way he's obviously supremely smart, but he can sometimes be abrasive. He can be impatient with employees. He enjoys working in a combative culture. And that was the case at Microsoft. And that is also the case of the Gates Foundation, except that what happens is that Microsoft rewarded that sort of competitive, culture, whereas the Gates Foundation, I think people come from very different backgrounds. So it sat uncomfortably inside the Gates Foundation, but it struck me as really interesting that he was essentially the same person, but he had also changed his image over the decades, to find that continuity, the consistency in so many ways, but to then place it against how we looked at him as a nerd, as this sort of ruthless monopolist, as this, philanthropist.
Rockefeller, like robber baron kind of thing,
Like,
as you write
right,
about.
absolutely. Absolutely.
What was the antitrust? Was the antitrust issue at Microsoft, was that a pivotal turning point for him, or when do you think this metamorphosis or transformation began?
Yeah, it did. I think he had always said that he was going to give the bulk of his fortune to philanthropy. I think the time hadn't been decided. And you have to remember that in the 1990s, there was only Microsoft. Now we think about Google and Amazon and Facebook and a lot of companies that are facing similar antitrust scrutiny. But in the 1990s, the second half of the 90s, Microsoft was it. It was the company. It captured everyone's imagination. But also, and as a result of that, I think Gates's performance, even though we didn't have social media then and we didn't have viral moments, Gates's performance riveted the nation, and people realized that this was a man who had become a distraction for Microsoft. So I think it made sense for him to then step down from the CEO role in 2000. And also he was tired. I think he said, a source of mine told me that he was tired, didn't know where else to go. And he just also felt that Microsoft was a shining example of American innovation, and why was the government going against him? And so I think there was a lot of confusion and a lot of pain. And then he turned to philanthropy because it was something he had always intended to do. And he found that he really liked it. And then it was go big or go home, because that's who Gates is. He started Microsoft, changed the personal computing world, and now he's changed philanthropy with this mammoth foundation.
Hey, you mentioned antitrust. There's a headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal right now. Kind of perfect timing on your part, I should say. U.S. antitrust enforcers are reviewing Google remedy options in a rare bid to break up Alphabet's Google as one of the options being considered by the Justice Department after a landmark court ruling found that the company monopolized the online search market, according to people with knowledge of the deliberations.
Do you want to point out shares of Alphabet are down about 1.3% in the aftermarket. The move would be Washington's first push to dismantle a company for illegal monopolization since unsuccessful efforts to break up Microsoft. We were just talking about that. That was, of course, 2 decades ago. Less severe options include forcing Google to share more data with competitors and measures to prevent it from gaining an unfair advantage in AI products. This is according to the people who asked not to be identified discussing private conversations. Again, shares of Alphabet down about 1.5% in the aftermarket. Want to get back to, we're talking with Anupreeta Das. She is a South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. Her new book, as we said, is about Bill Gates, billionaire, nerd, savior, king, Bill Gates and his quest to shape our world. Just get about a minute and a half and then we'll come back and talk some more. Did you find a lot of surprises in this process in terms of new things you learned about Bill Gates?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, Carol, is we didn't really understand. And I think that I think the entire world, doesn't quite understand why he met with Jeffrey Epstein so many times. And the question for me that's been the most interesting to explore is that if you're Gates or if you're a billionaire, you have armies of people whose job it is to sustain and polish and nurture your image, right? Building Bill's brand is something I examine in the book. And yet you have, despite having all of these people, even a basic Google search, right, would reveal that Epstein by then was a convicted sex offender and someone who perhaps wasn't the best kind of person from an optics standpoint for a billionaire with what
Right.
Gates was trying to do to interact. So that was surprising to me. It was a failure, a lapse of judgment that I wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
But it also ties back to the personality that Gates is.
We'll continue on this because I do agree that this is an interesting aspect of certainly his story that is still being told, but that you cover so much. We're going to come back with Preeta Das, her new book, Billionaire, Nerd, Savior, King. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Businessweek right here on Bloomberg Radio.
I want to get right back to Anupreeta Das. She's South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. Her new book, Billionaire, Nerd, Savior, King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape Our World. Preeta, you were talking about Jeffrey Epstein just moments ago and the relationship that Bill Gates had with Jeffrey Epstein. And I got to tell you, the parts in your book that focus on that have gotten a lot of media attention over the last couple of weeks. Just explain what you learned about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and why they found themselves having a relationship.
Yeah, so what happened, my best reconstruction based on my reporting and documents is that in 2010, you had the Giving Pledge, which was this effort, essentially a get out the vote campaign by Gates, Warren Buffett, and Melinda French Gates to get other billionaires to pledge to commit half or more of their fortunes to charity. And at that time, a lot of billionaires were very interested in finding a way to put their money to use. Having the money is almost easier than figuring out how to give it away wisely. And so the Gates Foundation was very much set up to use billions of dollars. And Gates was in the middle of this massive push toward polio eradication. The foundation had been working with other entities, and it was one of those times when Gates wanted to raise a lot of money. So Epstein, kind of being in these circles of influence and power, he's someone who kind of collected bits and pieces of information, used leverage wherever he could, and realized that there might be an opportunity for him to pitch something called a donor advised fund. And he wrote to JP Morgan, and JP Morgan had like another relationship with the Gates Foundation. So he looked at all of this. He began pitching this idea for a donor advised fund. He reached out to people who he knew at the Gates Foundation who had an overlap with Gates, of course, and began seeking an introduction. Now, Gates took that introduction. He came and visited Epstein at his house the first time, and then there was another meeting where there was a presentation. Epstein had slides and everything. So that until then, perhaps all well and good, but after that, the fact that he kept meeting with Epstein several times, ostensibly to discuss philanthropy, and Gates has always said that that was the only reason, and that he was sorry for the lapse in judgment. But it still is a question for Gates, essentially, because he is perhaps the only person who would know why he kept going back and meeting with Epstein. There are people who say that Gates was enamored of Epstein's lifestyle. He did write to some employees of the Gates Foundation after, saying that, he does have an adventurous, different lifestyle, but it's not for me. I'm not putting words into Gates's mouth, but that was essentially the point of what he was saying. And so clearly there was maybe bemusement, maybe surprise, maybe anticipation. It's hard to say. But again, coming back to the point I was making earlier, it is a surprising lapse in judgment for the people who work for him. But for Gates himself, it's actually not that surprising, given that he does have a certain naivete when it comes to personal relationships.
Now, you said you didn't get to talk to Bill Gates, right, for the book?
No, I didn't. He turned down my request for an interview.
Were you able to, though, ask him any questions, like write and get responses, or no, nothing at all?
No. So what happened was that it was interesting because I sent them detailed fact-checking lists, both at Gates Ventures, which is a private firm, and the Gates Foundation back in January or February, months before. And they stalled and stonewalled and didn't acknowledge my emails. And at the end, when I said, you have to give me a comment, they said it was hearsay. And then just weeks before we went to publication, they got back on some of the Epstein related points, and they refuted and said that they could present documented evidence. And I asked for that, and they didn't provide anything. And the book went to print. And then the Daily Mail of all, the Daily Mail and the New York Post put out these tidbits from my book, and they were overblown and not entirely accurate. But then Gates's private firm then put out a statement saying that it was all wild allegations, and that they presented me with documented evidence that I chose to ignore, which is not true.
Speaking of wild things that potentially could come up, I was joking at the top when I said the microchip vaccine stuff, but only half joking in the sense that these are real conspiracy theories about Bill Gates. Can you talk a little bit about where those come from and the idea of this quote unquote Davos elite that wants to control the world?
I think the fact that Gates was so prominent suddenly everywhere. He was suddenly everywhere. He was talking about vaccines. He was sharing the stage with Dr. Anthony Fauci. He was advocating. He was kind of out there everywhere. You couldn't miss him, which led a lot of people to wonder. And I speak to, I have one person in the book who made the point that, I had always thought of Gates as the Microsoft co-founder, and suddenly why is this guy talking about vaccines? And so I think if you are prone to conspiracy theories, I think that was kind of the first sign for a lot of people that maybe Gates has some kind of vested interest. And, conspiracy theories obviously take on a life of their own. And I think there was a study, and don't quote me on this, but I think there's a study looking at the feasibility of having some information implanted into a person's under a person's skin. And it was an MIT feasibility study, and nothing came of it. But that led to this kind of big idea that somehow Gates was trying to, implant chips in people and kind of all manner of things. Now, I think for the vaccines, and, Gates was, he's a rational guy. He's driven by evidence and science and tech. And I think he just didn't understand why there were people questioning what seemed to him very obvious steps. He couldn't understand being a personal target of the conspiracy theories.
Preeta, we just have about 45 seconds left here. Your title, Billionaire, Nerd, Savior, King, which is the most appropriate? as you finish your book in terms of which word really you would most closely identify with him? And as I said, only got about 40 seconds.
Today it would be king. He really kind of is on top of so many. I would say savior, king, perhaps. The billionaire is a fact. The nerd is a version of him back in the day. But today he's kind of on top of the world, sharing the stage with heads of state. And he is a savior of people in the global south with the Gates Foundation. So I would say savior, king.
Very cool stuff. Really enjoyed this, and good luck with the book, and really glad that we could get time with you. Anupreeta Das. Preeta Das is South Asia correspondent for the New York Times, and her new book is Billionaire, Nerd, Savior, King, Bill Gates, and His Quest to Shape Our World. That book is out today. Looking forward to that, and that's, no doubt about that, probably going to hit our weekend podcast and broadcast.
Yeah, I think that's safe to say.